She's responsible for developing innovative resources that communicate research findings around the prevention of chronic disease to maximize impact on policy and practice. So the reason why we asked Ainsley to talk today is that we have seen a real shift in research around really being able to show impact. So funding bodies are really interested in being able to demonstrate value for money of taxpayer money. There's been moves certainly at the ARC where, NHMRC investigator grants are now being asked to demonstrate what kind of impact we're seeing. And globally, like in Canada and the UK, there's been I think we're going to get there, that funding will ultimately be tied to research impact. So I'll hand over to Ainsley. So hopefully at the end of her talk, if you have any questions, please type them up and then Ainsley will address them. Thank you.
Thanks, Anna, and thanks for having me here today at Lunchtime Seminar Series. So as Anna said, I'm here on behalf of the Australian Prevention Partnership Centre. And the Partnership Centre is one of 3 NHMRC partnership centres for better health. So these are large government-funded research policy collaborations. So today I'm going to talk about knowledge mobilisation in the context of co-produced partnership research. And this is when researchers and policymakers or practitioners collaborate in all stages of the research process. It's internationally recognised, as Anna referred to, and it's a key way of improving the uptake of evidence. So just for a bit of background on me and the Communications Centre at the Prevention Centre, I'm the Publications Manager, and in this role, as Anna said before, I'm responsible for developing innovative resources that communicate our research findings on chronic disease prevention and ultimately to maximise impact on policy and practice. So our comms team also consists of Communications Manager Helen Signey, who's in the audience with us today. And Helen is a former journalist and I'm a former scientific publisher. So together, we believe that the internal and external communications of the centre are vital. They're especially when trying to mobilise knowledge through co-production. In fact, we'd argue that partnership research can't reach its full potential without a properly resourced and dedicated comms team. Sorry, I'll just try and move on the slides. Just having a bit of difficulty with moving on the slides. That's okay, I can keep talking while we try and sort it out. So the Prevention Centre was set up by the NHMRC to improve the uptake of evidence in policy and practice through co-production of research. We were established in 2013, initially with $22.6 million grant over 5 years. Last year, we received an additional $10 million in funding from the Australian Government's Medical Research Future Fund. And we have just recently received a further $7.7 million from the NHMRC to enable us to operate for another 5 years, which is very exciting for us because this represents probably the most significant investment in chronic disease prevention in Australia in recent years. This model of partnership research is quite new in Australia. So this has been a really bold initiative also on part of the Australian Government and our funding partners, who's the Australian Government Department of Health, New South Wales Health, HCF Research Foundation and ACT Health. We are hosted by the Sachs Institute, who I'm sure many of you will be familiar with, as it's a national leader in Australia in promoting this use of research evidence in health policy and in running large-scale practice policy collaborations. So our focus is the prevention of chronic disease, and as I'm sure you're all aware, this is a highly complex area, meaning cross-sectoral, multidisciplinary partnership research is a really critical way of effectively encouraging the use of evidence in policy and practice. It's a prerequisite that our research is co-produced by teams of researchers and decision makers. We now have more than 223 individuals from 36 organisations. And that includes major universities such as Sydney University, RMIT, ANU and Deakin. And we also have policy partners in every state and territory, government, as well as in private organisations. So at the moment, we're currently running, I think it's nearly 55 distinct projects, and they're all supported by the Coordinating Centre, which is based in Sydney. So this diagram was developed to show how knowledge translation works at the Prevention Centre. So the communications team sits here in the Coordinating Centre in the green cog at the bottom of the diagram. And it's one of the central entities that keep the whole partnership working, along with the leadership executive, a governance authority, and the International Scientific Advisory Committee. And of course, the researchers are in that blue cog with project teams as the heading. So our job is to undertake activities that enable the partnership. So we support all of those 6 elements in the dark grey inner circle. And these are our partnership strategies. And I just like especially the knowledge translation, the engagement, and the capacity building. So the idea is that all these elements work together to keep the partnership going. And the ultimate aim of the centre, and for us as communicators, is to achieve that outer circle, developing new knowledge and methods, making available policy relevant advice, and ultimately influencing decision-making. So this is the theory, but in reality, we've got different research projects happening all across the country, involving hundreds of researchers in every state and territory and in federal government as well. So this is a social network analysis, and this is just showing connections between just the core researchers. So we have many more than that. So as I'm sure you can appreciate, bringing this group together, a group of people together into a coherent whole has been a big challenge. And so probably more than in many other organisations, we have a big focus on internal communications. So, and the purpose of that is to keep people in the Prevention Centre engaged and informed. And in fact, the very first person to be employed after the Deputy Director was a communications manager. So these days, the communications team is included as part of the research process itself. We're quite unlike other academic environments in that right from the outset of each project, we're called in to help people with their messaging and help them describe the complexity of what they're trying to do. So this means we're trying to get the researchers thinking about messaging and impact right from the time they're designing the research question. And this involvement, it doesn't necessarily mean we're involved at each and every team project meeting. It's just at those critical points throughout the project. So we also have a quarterly reporting mechanism, a schedule we call it, and that's to help us keep on track of their progress and ensure that any milestones are not missed. So we've designed this quarterly reporting schedule so that researchers are required to think about knowledge mobilisation, impact and messaging. So as well as standard reporting on milestones and budget, we ask them to describe any activities involving building partnerships with policymakers and get them to try and think of examples of how they're influencing decision-making and policy. We also remind them to plan for knowledge translation and with our help, and to give us concise key messages about their progress and which we can then use on the website and in our other communications. So this is the way we try and make knowledge translation and our involvement in it more an organic process rather than just coming in as we more traditionally have as a comms role at the end when the project finishes. So up on the screen now, you can see the elements of a successful research collaboration. So when we look at the literature on the elements of this or a successful collaboration, we see that building shared ownership and trust between stakeholders is really important. as well as establishing a shared vision and goals, nurturing those connections and sharing the knowledge. So we also know from feedback from some of our researchers that they're concerned they're working in isolation, and that what they need is to understand a clear purpose to what we're all working towards. So in our experience, communications has been central to all of this. We've connected people from all over the country through our regular emails and our electronic newsletters. We've also run a lot of events to showcase the work of our research projects. And we think it's even more important, what we've found above all of those is building and maintaining those vital connections that keep us operating as a whole. So our messaging and branding play an important role as well in trying to create that sense of cohesion and common purpose. And creating a distinct profile as well of the centre helps us to convey how the whole is greater than the sum of the parts in this collaboration. But it hasn't been easy. The Prevention Centre's program of work is very large and ambitious. And working within this large collaboration like this means we need to take into account those competing cultures, the different contexts and requirements of researchers, policymakers, and practitioners. So as many of you are sure are aware, academics and policymakers often can have the different goals and timeframes, and evidence may play just a small part of that policymakers' decision-making process of whether they may need evidence more quickly than academics are able to provide it. On the other hand, there's often resistance from our researchers to communicate their findings before they're published in an academic journal, and they can be wary of us also simplifying their messaging or publicising their findings in a way that they think will compromise their working relationships with policymakers. So to try and overcome some of these issues, we've developed this suite of innovative communication products, and these are designed to convey those key policy relevant messages in a timely way, but without compromising the scientific process. So as you can see on the screen, we have this suite of e-newsletters, fact sheets, findings briefs, news stories, webinars, podcasts. All of them are developed to distill those large amounts of information into formats that are accessible to busy policymakers. So the focus of our external communications as well is to constantly find new ways, innovative ways to communicate the research findings clearly and concisely, and in that form that policymakers can easily understand and then ultimately act on. And what are we up against? Several of these barriers may sound familiar to you. Decision makers don't often have enough time to read or even apply the evidence. For example, one policymaker I've heard saying to a researcher in the corridor, "My diary is full, but explain to me in the lift on the way to my next meeting your research project." So you may literally have 30 seconds or less to explain your research. Also, research doesn't always address the policy or practice questions. For instance, will it work in the real world? Is it scalable? Is it replicable? And evidence isn't, I've referred to this before, sorry, but evidence isn't available at the time it is needed. And you may have received such responses. That's just not our office's priority at the moment. Decision makers may not have the skills or capacity to interpret the research in a timely fashion. They may not know who they can quickly talk to for trusted advice before they brief a government. So hopefully our co-production approach helps to overcome some of these problems. It means policymakers are actually in the room right at the start to provide that input and to ensure those research answers, or the research answers the actual policy question or the issue on their own agenda. But we as communications professionals can also help by tailoring these research outputs into those forms that are suitable for the people who actually need to use the research. So our approach to overcoming these barriers is that we focus on purpose and audience. We try to determine what policy partners need to know, when they need to know it, how to summarise those complex research into forms that are useful, and how do we communicate the so what of the research. No matter how many months and years our researchers have spent producing their findings, it's pointless if it only sits in that online journal. We need to convince the policymakers to actually act on it. So what we've found most effective is an approach that's based on journalism, using storytelling to cut through. We write stories about the research in a way that provokes impact. And even when talking about complex public health science, such as systems thinking or dynamic simulation modelling, and even though our primary audience is policymakers, there is relevance in the power of storytelling. As humans, we're more responsive to stories over facts. Stories help us relate, they allow us to empathise, and they allow our brains to process information in a more memorable form. So we believe this is an important technique to use in public health more generally to make our voices heard. So we use storytelling in our external communications to convey those key messages in a way that will attract the attention of policymakers without dumbing down the science, but while also maintaining the integrity of the work and trust of the researcher. So we do this by trying to reinforce that innovative communication doesn't change the science, it's just a delivery method. And since storytelling is an integral part of design thinking, it was a logical next step to investigate the use of infographics and visualizations to create better visual communications that go beyond simply being an add-on and actually enhance the narrative. So why infographics in particular? So the power of infographics is in their combination of words and imagery. They can convey messages that move people to change. And visuals, unlike words, have the capacity to communicate complex and complete concepts instantaneously to a larger number of recipients. They act as a visual representation showing correlations, patterns, connections, differences, relative size, chronological order. So in essence, they tell a story. So we have developed two types of infographics. What we saw on the previous slide, which was our more bespoke kind of infographic, designed especially for a specific project, or this is our standard infographic, which is more has more of a formula to it. We use this standard type of infographic in our findings briefs, which is the policy style briefs that we produce. And even though it looks simple and easy to create, unbelievably, it's probably the most challenging part of the findings brief to develop. Within each of those boxes, we are limited to probably 10 to 12 words each. So we're trying to tell a story within those 3 boxes. And the solution that we've found is to standardize that content. So we only look at the problem, which is in the first box, what we did in the second box, and then what we found in the third box. So across all our findings briefs, we've developed this standard formula, and it actually seems to be working. It's also working because the audience is becoming familiar with our products, and they know what to expect, and they nearly anticipate it as well. So how do we communicate the findings from a 90-page report in succinct policy relevant forms in a way that doesn't jeopardize publication? So when this particular project finished, I was provided with the 90-page report, and this was the source document that I was meant to produce all our communications from. But in this format, after reading through it, the so what of the project wasn't clear. So I needed to interview the researcher to find the answers to those of our most 2 important questions. What was surprising in this work, and so what? So all the other information will be in the academic journal articles. So Helen and I call this finding the gems. And I love the interview process. This is my favorite part. For us, this is the time to uncover those gems of information often buried or even non-existent in the traditional report format. And we do it by asking the researcher to put themselves in the shoes of a policymaker. trying to determine the best policy or whether an intervention will succeed or not. So this often requires a researcher to make quite a substantial leap from what did I do to what should others do. And sometimes the question is met with resistance, especially if findings are inconclusive or even non-existent in the research or need more research. But we've found that there's always something we can find. So to help us with this, we have what we've called an end of project checklist. And this helps to guide us when interviewing researchers to determine those key messages, clarify the findings, and also determine the suitable delivery platforms. So purpose, I'll just quickly go through what we mean by them since I've only got one word steps on each of these checklists. The first one, purpose, we ask what they want to most achieve with this research. So I asked them, if you could only communicate one key message, what would it be? Secondly, audience, vitally important. Who is your audience and who do you most want to influence? Thirdly, pre-publication. So do you have any pre-publication concerns? Do you have any papers about to come out that we could jeopardize? Essential to know. 4, timing, also critical. Is there a newsworthy event that we can synchronize with? Can we link in with a political cycle or a conference even? Then we try to determine what activities are most suited to what they found and ask what they're trying to achieve. So we have our standard products of information on the website and our findings brief, but we also ask them to consider media releases, opinion pieces, webinars, ministerial briefings, and even setting up meetings with policymakers and ministers. Design requirements, there I mean, I need to ask them what design features are required, for instance, with the infographics, if something lends itself within the report to that, or simply are there partners that we need to co-brand with. Unexpected findings. So this is critical to maintain our relationship with our policymakers because we need to know if there's any unexpected or controversial findings from the research. Is there any sensitivity around the research or with funding partners that we need to be aware of? Were there limitations to the project that we need to know about? Maintaining that good relationship with our policy partners is just so vital for us. And they don't usually mind us communicating those unfavourable things. We just have to need to make sure that there aren't any surprises. So next steps, quite obvious what they plan to do next with their research or if that's the end of the story. And finally, final words, have we missed anything? Have we missed any key steps or key points? So to go to another example, this is, in this example, after years of working on the project and after using our tried and tested end of project checklist, the lead researcher still found it difficult to step out of that box that she'd been in those years of researching and to answer quickly and simply the so what. So it took several interviews and we worked together to find that one key piece of advice. And for this one, it was that childhood obesity management programs needed to be embedded in government to work. That's one example. To jump to another one, this is our latest and probably most challenging product that Helen and I have had to produce. It's our Prevention Work series of podcasts. So the challenges are a result of using new technology. We had to learn about where to host them, when to host them, what formats to host them in. And it's also because it has a wider audience than our other products have and quite a different audience to our standard other projects. The podcast actually targets the wider community and not just policymakers. So our purpose went further than that of our usual project-based communications. And just to explain how it did this, or our strategy for how it did this, or what we'd like it to do, is to tackle those wider issues in chronic disease prevention. Also to encourage public debate around prevention issues and increase public understanding of the challenges that we're facing in prevention today in Australia. It's also a channel that we can showcase our researchers in a much more engaging way, alternative format, the audio format over the printed or online, watching on a screen format. It allows us to draw out common themes across all the different research projects. So that in itself has been a bonus. And it also is establishing the Prevention Centre as a hub for prevention, the go-to place. So please feel free to listen in. You can visit our website and there's a link on the homepage to the podcast. The only thing I would add to this is that we do recommend producing these podcasts professionally. I don't know if any of you are podcast listeners, but there's a plethora of podcasts out there of different range of professional expertise, I suppose. We actually use Gretchen Miller, who's a former ABC journalist, and she helps us produce the episodes because they do require that extra expertise to make the storytelling actually compelling to listen to. So there's a range of, that's our first 5 episodes are listed on the screen, and we actually have, I think, another 3 in production that should be coming out towards the end of this year and the beginning of next year. So I've gone through different examples of our products, but how do we know if it works? How do we know if this approach actually works? Well, earlier in the year, we finished an evaluation of the knowledge mobilisation processes of the Prevention Centre. We used a mixed methods approach of surveys and interviews, and initial feedback has been positive. We undertook a survey of policy and practice partners to explore how they had engaged with the Prevention Centre. We also got their perceptions of our resources, how they'd used them in practice, and we had just under 80 people completed the survey. So we found that people engage with us mainly by reading our e-newsletter, which is known as the Chronicle, or accessing our systems thinking resources on the website, advice from our researchers, or through our findings briefs. So the majority of respondents reported positive perceptions of our resources, with more than 80% indicated they thought they were innovative, well presented, informative, and understandable. And most indicated they would access them in the future. We had 94% said they would refer others in their network to our resources. And then perhaps the most valuable was the question about the reasons for not using our resources. So for those who hadn't applied the knowledge, it was mainly due to a lack of momentum for change in their own agency, or difficulties in integrating that information into a policy or program, or the information was simply not sufficient enough to support action. So there was only a small proportion of respondents that indicated that the way in which the information was presented was a barrier to application. So mostly our resources have been used to confirm their thinking around an issue, justify an existing policy position, or to determine priorities for future investment. So our approach to the communications has enabled the Prevention Centre to bring together our many members, and it's also allowed policymakers to have their voices heard. We've improved the communication of research to policymakers and facilitated the sharing of ideas, as well as collaboration among individuals who may not have otherwise have worked together. So in our view, we believe that communications needs to be embedded in any research collaboration from the very outset, because it's a capacity that's is central not just to the dissemination of new knowledge, but to the very success of collaborative research in itself. Thank you.
Thank you, Ainsley. We're going to open up to questions now, but I might get the first shot, which is the benefit of doing this. So a lot of our listeners, I guess, would perhaps not be in a similar situation where they're in a centre which has dedicated resources and someone that they can go to and kind of bounce ideas off. How would researchers, especially early career researchers, start this process or kind of start to dip their toes into the whole world of communications or translation? What's kind of like the easiest to pick, I guess?
The one thing, if I had one thing I could only tell you, it would be to look at your purpose and your audience. If you keep coming back to knowing who your audience is, if you keep engaging with your audience and asking them those questions. What do they need? When do they need it? It's really just about having those conversations. So if they don't have the communication support, they can do it. It's manageable. And I think it does, even just doing that would make a big difference to what they can create. An audience purpose, of course, always come back and revisit your purpose. Purpose can change. The research might change along the way. We've seen that many times. Or of course something comes out of it that you didn't expect to come out of it. You might just have to tweak it or alter it slightly. But also, sorry, if I can add another gem, focus testing it on other people, focus testing it on other people that are your audience if you have that opportunity. So I will sometimes run something past someone in the office who hasn't had anything to do with the work before. And just to get that sense check, does this make sense? Ask yourself, does it make sense? It seems like simple things to do, but there's simple things that can make a big difference to the end product. And I think just revisiting those purpose, audience, and engaging with your audience and knowing what those three things can help a lot.
Yeah, great. Do we have any questions from online? If you could type them up, hopefully we'll be able to see them in this technological issues. If not...
And the people can just ask questions, can't they?
Yes, they can, Christine. That was Christine Cowie.
Oh, Chris, do you want to say that again, Chris?
No, I don't have a question yet, but I'm just saying instead of typing, people can just unmute and ask directly, can't they?
Okay. Yep, we've got a question from the floor.
So my question is, how much time do you think that researchers should budget, for want of a better description, towards this? So, should they dedicate an hour a week or half an hour a week, or is it really dependent on the project?
Yeah, I think it is dependent on the project. It's also dependent on your investment in what you want that end product to be. And if you have an idea of what you want it to be at the beginning, it's like, how long is a piece of string? It's really hard a question to ask. It's also about how big is your project and how much support you have. Even if it's not communication support, how many researchers do you have as part of your team? I know in one of our projects, the lead investigator has delegated that task to her project team, and she actually takes a back step now and lets them lead the communications part. And it's a valuable lesson in learning for them how to communicate their complex findings and their complex research. For me, I would set aside some time at least to think about it, and maybe not in the office as well. Like, I know it sounds, sometimes you're so immersed in what you're doing in the office that even just a change of location and thinking about it or talking about it to someone else can help you get a different perspective on it. But I think an investment in time weekly or at least monthly and scheduled in so it doesn't slip by the wayside would be invaluable.
Got a question from Anthony Flynn. He's asking if you work exclusively with NHMRC projects, or are you open to being engaged by externals, others?
Just NHMRC,
just
unfortunately.
NHMRC.
But we'd encourage you to go to our website, and you can stay in the loop in terms of what we're doing and what research projects or topic areas we're covering by signing up to the e-newsletter, which is free, and it's only a bi-monthly newsletter, so it doesn't, bombard you every week. And we usually have highlights in there of what work we're doing or those milestones that we encounter. So, yeah.
I might ask another question if there's no other questions online. I had a question around the timing. So from what I can see, it's really important to engage with your stakeholders or potential audience or whoever you want to call it at the very beginning, but often you are already in a project or you've started a project and it's, 5 years on. is there still benefit in engaging? And what's the best time? Do you just wait till the end and focus on dissemination, or do you start those conversations halfway through, or how does it work?
Ideally, like for us, we've got that advantage of having the policy partners or practitioners coming on throughout the process. So they may not all be there throughout the whole length of the research process, but at least we have opportunities, and we also try and create those opportunities too, where we can have face-to-face meetings and get to engage with them. It's amazing how many of those incidental little conversations you have at morning tea at these events or lunch, where you find out who's working on what and with who and how we're all doing the same thing, or we've got areas that overlap.
Yeah.
Look, ideally, I have found I've worked in both ways.
Yeah.
So I've worked where I come in at the end of the process, and it's really hard to tell the story if you're only getting that end stage process, because things can happen along the way which actually add to the story. And it's not just the successes. Something really valuable we've learned is to own not the failures, but the lessons learned or the mistakes made. And actually that's part of the story. And that's what makes it more engaging and more compelling to policymakers. So it's really just being honest about how we tell the story. And yeah, ideally, if you can be engaging with people all the way along. And I know that's not always in the real world, that's not always possible. You can do it the other way around, but yeah, we've just found with our storytelling that gives us the complete picture and has made it more engaging. And also the researchers often forget what's happened. If you don't verbalize it, or there's so much to get through in your research, and there's so many outputs you have to do and so many people you have to report to. So it's easy to forget, oh yeah, that's right, that happened, and that made a huge difference to how we approach the end of the project or who got involved in the project.
So it sounds like one piece of advice might be just give it a go. Just go out there, and you don't have to be an expert in it.
Absolutely
you can just
not.
Start.
Just have a go.
Have a go, try and contact those people.
Yeah, and do you know what? A lot of the policymakers who Helen and I have spoken to have actually said to us, because sometimes we've been a bit hesitant because we know we ask them a lot for a lot of things. We ask them we try not to, but when we've got a big report coming up and we need to fill in all the gaps of information, we can often have that tendency to bombard the lead investigator who we know is the expert and has all the answers and the perfect quote on the tip of her tongue. But yeah, sorry, it's just something that we need to do. I can't encourage it more than that.
Yeah. Got another question.
Can I just ask you about kind of interacting with, say, policymakers as an example? We're not part of kind of this network. Is it just how do you actually kind of approach that and get into that kind of world?
Yeah, so sorry, that's what I was trying to say, was that they are willing to engage with us. And I know sometimes you can email them and you won't get an answer. But one particular policymaker has said to us, please just pick up the phone and call me. And sometimes
so
is
that kind of from your perspective with a network and a whole lot of...
Yeah, so we do have that advantage.
Whereas if say, we're not in HMRC projects or whatever, we're just kind of in the old kind of...
If you can find... if you can find the events where they'll be at, if you can attend, if they have similar things like this with lunchtime seminar series or conferences where they will be speaking or they'll be involved or they'll have their team involved in the conferences, it's vital to turn up and go along and just consistently go along and establish a face to the name. And you just have to look for those opportunities, and it is time consuming, I realise that, but it can produce results. So yeah, I recognise that we have that advantage, that we have the established relationships now, but we're also building new ones with these new projects that are coming up. We'll probably take on new partners and have to start again. And that's probably where those events come in handy, is that we do try and they're not just our events run by us, we try and co-brand with, like, for instance, the Menzies Centre and and we might volunteer an expert of ours to go along to their lunchtime seminar series, and we'll co-brand it. And then either Helen and I, or both of us, always try and be there to have those conversations. And even if it's not the, the topic area isn't actually that valuable for us, but we know those people will be there, we'll turn up to show that we're represented and we're interested.
Oh, yeah, sorry, Helen.
I was just going to say, you want to talk a bit about Twitter and opinion pieces as well, and how useful they are to establish
Would you like to?
searches as
You don't want to? Yeah, that's your opinion pieces.
Yeah,
I'll just introduce Helen's communications manager, as I said before. But, she's the writer of the team. So
yeah, I was just going to add to that point. We use Twitter a lot, and write for the conversation, or you've got to think about where your audience look, where they go. So it might be the Mandarin and for policymakers, or the conversation, or whatever. And it's a really good way of describing research in a lay, user-friendly way, and establishing yourself as an expert. And the feedback we've had from our policy partners is, they might not necessarily be interested in that specific project, but if they want an expert on something, they might well call you, and that would be you're in. So it's about building your profile as much as anything.
We've got a question from here and another one on the chat, but we'll go with this one first.
I was just curious to know, how do you define or measure success after the fact? So after these reports have been written up, they're in the hands of these policy partners, your partners in the policy as well. How do you actually define or measure success?
it's our biggest challenge at the moment, actually.
Sorry, the question was how to measure success in research translation.
Yeah. It's been one of our biggest challenges, especially as we're getting to the end of our first 5 years of funding, and we're trying to report on the findings and show how we're measuring that, the impact. We have done the first valuation, which I referred to, and now we're just in the middle of doing a follow-up one. We nearly need another 5 years to have that benchmark of where we did the first survey and interviews, and then to show what's happened, what's changed between that point and the next 5 years. I think it's going to consist of more surveys and interviews with our partners or our audience. Another way we're trying to measure it is for this final report. We've done our whole series of interviews with policymakers, and we're trying to go to that next level where we're not just taking quotes from them about us, but we're trying to verify where they've used it and what they've used it in. So we're now collecting all of that data that we can from all our different projects. So I just wrote one up recently on the livability project, and that's been used in several different councils in Melbourne in their actual strategies for the next, some of them until 2025 year plans. And so that's, really encouraging to see. But some forms, especially the engagement, which is so subtle, it's really difficult to measure. And so really it just comes down to those interviews with the policymakers. And yeah, taking on, the hardest bit is asking them to give us feedback on things that are not working. So that, people are often, they will tell us, oh, that's fantastic. And they'll talk about the findings briefs and they use them. But then we really have to dig deep in terms of interviewing them as well. So we do that interview process in that sort of style as well, to say, to find out what's not working, because often it's not visible or it's not tangible what's not working, but it takes that conversation, to have that conversation, to find out what their need is again and what their purpose is, and to revisit what our comm strategy is internally and externally, and going back to those, what our key messages are, and then what our products are. So we're continually refining those products and checking that they're working and that they're useful to them in that format. And that's another reason why we took on the podcast, to just see, sort of as an experiment, to see if they were open to that broader purpose and broader audience. But I think the bottom line is it's going to take a little bit more time to us to actually measure it and be able to show that.
So Ivan, who's from CAR, is asking, how do you approach communicating uncertainty to a non-statistically trained audience, especially when uncertainty is large, evidence is weak, stakes high, and decisions urgent? So I guess this is about essentially science literacy. I see this question as, how do you increase people's science literacy within this particular context?
Yeah, sure. I'll let Helen take that one.
So it goes back to developing the key messages. So they're not always, when you're reporting to an academic community or in the literature, the uncertainty is something that's important for you to report, but you've got to take a step back. What does the audience need to know? So is your audience patients or the public? What's the key thing that this uncertainty reveals? And it's that kind of messaging that you've got to get to. And if you haven't got anything concrete to say, maybe now is not the time to say it until you do have that certainty. But there's always a message in there. So, for example, we had one, the research saying, oh no, we need more research, and we can't possibly draw a conclusion from this. It was, and we said, well, there's something must have come out. You must have some recommendation, and it was something that had come out quite early in the research process. They hadn't even put it in the conclusions, but it was policy relevant, and the policymakers found it very useful. So, it's thinking through the eyes of the audience.
Mm-hmm. Yep. If we have no more questions, I think we'll wrap this up. Thanks all for attending, either virtually or physically. We'll be putting up the recording on the CAR website, so car-cre.org.au, and more questions. Thanks. So that'll be uploaded, and I'll probably send you a copy as well. So thank you.
You're welcome.
Ainsley and Helen, for coming and putting up with the terrible technical issues. And thank you to everyone for listening. The next CAR webinar will be around in a month's time, and you'll be probably receiving an invite to that. So thank you, and have a great afternoon.